Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Paul Meitner coming to you today with our 8th session of Luther's Reformation. We looked at the last session about the spark, if you will, that genesis of Luther's theology, where he's gotten clear of the past misconceptions. He has a good, basic, solid understanding. He's yet to work through all the implications of that yet. He still considers himself a good son of the church and a faithful doctor of the church, which of course he is in the universal setting. But he's failed to really see where this is going to lead and how this is going to change things. And again, we've seen part of the reason for that is he's so busy carrying out and being faithful to his calling in that time. But this idea is about ready to, bam, cause a huge thing, cause a major shakeup, and one of the most influential, if not the most influential, change of events in the history of Western civilization. It's going to change completely the course of human history, and we can't play down just how big of an event 1517 is. Even if you are simply a secular historian, even if you're a person who's not religious at all, you say that the only reason you have that luxury today is because of what Luther brought about. The influence of Luther's Reformation is going to be felt in almost every aspect of society moving forward here. But we've seen this spark in Luther. But now today we're going to look at the powder keg it's about to hit. And it's a complicated powder keg. I know for those of you who don't like history, names and dates, it may not be the most popular thing you want to listen to. But if you can put aside that for a second and just kind of think of this as a chessboard, all these different pieces that are on the chessboard, you'll have a very good understanding of why, when those 95 theses are put on the board, put on the door of the castle church, why this becomes such a huge explosion, why all the pieces are in place. And I want you to back up also in this session. I want you to think, look at the hand of God again. I want to stress this, that to a certain extent, the history of the world is the history of God's hand in bringing salvation to his people. I think that ultimately is what I see as a believer, how God moves all things around. For he has his reasons. I don't know what all his reasons are, but I do know that they always are done with the ultimate purpose in mind of bringing salvation to individuals and salvation to his church. But I think you can see it very clearly here in the events that lead up to the explosion of October 31st, 1517. So let's begin. Let's jump into it. We have to start in two places, politics and papacy. And we just want to kind of fill in a little bit of what I'm going to go briefly over a bunch of names and places, then I'll kind of take each one of them individually. You have the papacy at this time, and the papacy at this time is not in a good place. And it's not better. Remember that we talked about a number of sessions ago, I think session 2, we talked about how the papacy had been on the decline spiritual. Well, the 100 years before Luther, the papacy is trying to claw its way back into power and importance, and it does so by being a patron of the art. Again, there's not a shortage of money going on in Rome. Rome has plenty of money. Julius II is going to be probably the most powerful pope since Gregory VIII. He'll even lead armies into battle. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But he's known as God's terrible vicar, and I'll talk about that in a minute. He's followed by Leo the 10th, who is a Medici, and Leo the 10th has to be, I don't know if the worst pope of all time, but even the Catholics, I think, would probably say he is the worst pope of all time. That's a crown to wear, because there's been some pretty bad popes, but even from papal historians, Catholic historians, they say, I don't think there's any worse pope at the worst time than Leo X. Other things going on here, you also have the Holy Roman Empire. We have a hard time understanding exactly what this is. Honestly, the Holy Roman Empire lived well into the early part of the 20th century. It only really comes to an end at the end of World War I. The remains of the Austro-Hungarian Empire is the final dying breath of the Habsburg Empire, an empire that had lasted for almost 500 years. even longer if you take it from its very beginning. Very influential family who was the master of politics in Central Europe for many, many years. You see it pretty much at the zenith of its power at this point. We'll talk about Maximilian I and his connection to being the Holy Roman Emperor, and then how that is finally handed down to his grandson, Charles V, who will play a very important part in the Catholic Counter-Reformation, but also be the chief political antagonist of Luther during Luther's life and after Luther's death. Other things that are going on, we have to understand a little bit about the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire is, as one person has joked, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, and that's true in many, many cases. But it is really the political entity which the Lutheran Reformation is born in. And it's an interesting entity in the sense that it's one of the first constitutional political units in Western Europe. That they have a constitution. They have somewhat of a democratic ideal that's coming out of the Middle Ages. And finally, we're going to have to deal with some of the intra-Holy Roman Empire issues. There are people who are jockeying for position in the Holy Roman Empire, and that's going to cause some problems. And we're also going to see Luther's great patron, who's the Duke of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, who is a very, very, very influential man and a man who really gives Luther the breathing room and the Lutheran Reformation the breathing room in order for it to flourish in the years to come. But we're going to take each one of these, but this is kind of a general overview of the things that you have to understand are going on. These are all the pieces on the board. Now let's set the board up, and we'll start with the papacy. One of the things that we have a hard time understanding today is that in the Middle Ages, even into the 19th century, much of Italy was a political unit governed by the Pope. Now, these are pictures of Italian unification. Again, Germany and Italy in the 19th century, it was the first time in almost 1,000 years that they were a single entity. Up until that time, they had been a collection of various states, but now they had fused into one state, and that happened in Germany in the 1870s, and it happened in Italy around 1870 as well. But up to that time, you had in Italy the Pope controlling a large portion of central Italy, and in fact, one of the popes who did a lot of actual leading of soldiers into battle was Julius II. Julius II is the Pope before Leo X. He is known as God's terrible vicar. He's not a good guy. He is a guy who is a patron of the arts in some ways, and we'll see that. But he is a guy who is frantically fighting to reestablish the power of the papacy. Remember, the papacy is at a low ebb, roughly 100 years before he takes over the chair of St. Peter, and he is clawing it back to power. He really believes that the Pope is the embodiment of the church, the embodiment of Christ. No one's good. And any attack on his lands, any attack on his authorities, an attack on God himself. He really believes that. And so he's a guy who, leads armies into battle. This is actually a picture of him. You can tell that he's wearing armor, but he's also wearing that famous papal tiara as well. He believes this, and he leads battles, not always successfully, but he's a person who does vastly increase the wealth of the papacy during his time. He's a person who employs Raphael, he employs Michelangelo to do much of the work. For instance, he's the one who commissions the Sistine Chapel. He commissions much of the work of Raphael, some of the famous frescoes in Rome and the Vatican. And so he's a patron of the arts, but he is primarily thought of as a warrior. He's the warrior pope. Again, we see the hand of God in this. Had this guy been on the chair of St. Peter when Luther was around, Luther would have had his head on a spike before the end of business. But he's a guy who dies 1513, and he is replaced. It's kind of funny, at his death, Erasmus, the Rotterdam, under a pseudonym, so he wouldn't get in trouble, publishes a thing called Julius Exclusus, and it's a really kind of a funny little cartoon about, Julius dying and going to heaven and trying to get in, and St. Peter won't let him in because, you've been such an evil and wicked man. I'm not going to let you in because, and Julius says, but I have the keys to the kingdom of God. He says, yeah, those don't work here. And so, there had been side attacks, subtle, satire against the Pope. Even Dante's work. Dante has a number of popes in hell in Dante's Inferno. So there have been side attacks. People had recognized there were bad popes. Perhaps my favorite quotation of a pope that was really bad in the Middle Ages was Gregory VIII. And he came in like a lion, ruled like a wolf, and died like a dog. People recognized that the papacy had gone to a very low ebb. Julius was trying to restore that, trying to restore the prestige of the papacy. I don't want to be put too on the nose, but make the papacy great again would be my thought and my voice to put an anachronism on Julius II's papacy. Not a great guy. He probably would have made a pretty good king, but he makes a lousy pope for any number of reasons. The violence and bloodshed, not the least of which should never be involved in a man who is in charge of preaching the gospel. He is replaced with a guy who's worse, but in a different way, Leo X. Now, Leo X is the son of Lorenzo de Medici, the famous de Medici families of Florence. He is a lead player in the politics. Now, why does he want his son to be the Pope? Well, one of his chief antagonists, remember he's from Florence, one of his chief antagonists is the Papal States. He wants somebody who he can control for the Papal States. He couldn't control Julius. Julius made war on people that he was in league with. He can't go right after him lest he get banned or excommunicated or something like that. And so he tries to work his son. It takes him about 20 years to finally get his son in there. What's so bad about Leo is that Leo he's officially a priest and is officially a cardinal, but he doesn't even know how to say mass. He has to kind of go through, emergency priest and cardinal school once he gets elected pope, just so he knows how to just do the basic things. He's that far behind. He's elected for political reasons, but it just shows you how corrupt the election of the papacy had been by that point. By and far, the worst person that you could ever possibly put in the chair of St. Peter, and that's saying something. Leo de Medici. Now, again, Lorenzo de Medici is a famous patron of a number of people. Michelangelo is probably the most famous. Botticelli is another one of his famous things. So very wealthy, big merchant, huge amounts of money, great patron of the arts. So it's not surprising, of course, that when Leo goes to Rome, one of his chief things, I'm going to remake Rome into this glorious, beautiful city, this jewel. I'm going to make the glories of heaven appear on the streets of Rome. And so he takes up this audacious building plan, of which you can see today. I've never been to Rome myself. I've had a number of people gone there. And it is fascinating. It's amazing. This is the guy who starts that building. Julius actually was already starting it, but Leo takes it with reckless abandon. However, Leo also has other problems on his plate. The Ottoman Turkish Empire, Selim I, who's the Ottoman emperor at this time, is really starting to make inroads in Eastern Europe. They've already taken over Greece. They're working their way up what is present-day the Balkan Peninsula. And they are not very far from Vienna at this point. And if they take Vienna, the gates are open for the rest of Europe. And so he has a real problem with the Turk, Islam. Again, this idea that, Islam just in our time has become this violent force, not at all. Islam has always made its big increases by the sword. Islam is always spread by the sword. It's never spread by mission work. It is always spread by the sword. This guy really is trying to spread, and it's probably the greatest, it's the pinnacle of power for the Ottoman Empire. So he has a real problem with the Turk putting at risk Europe and putting at risk his position, the position of much of the political society of Europe. Uh, that being said, he doesn't take it all that seriously because we have some problems. One, not the least of which, is that Leo managed to bankrupt the Vatican in a short period of time. Leo was elected Pope in 1513. By 1517, he is really hurting for money. For instance, for his inauguration festival, he spent 100,000 ducats. Now, that in today's money is almost $1 million. Easily almost $1 million on his own inauguration. 1/7 of the treasury that was left on one festival for his inauguration. This is a spoiled, rotten little brat of Lorenzo de' Medici who doesn't know anything, even basic problems. And again, you're going to have this guy is he's a pig. He's a spiritual, bankrupt, moral pig. So much so that he even pawns the papal jewels. I've never really researched whether or not they got him back at any point, but I know that he did pawn papal jewels to make his money out. He also granted special favors to Jews and permitted them to erect a Hebrew printing press in Rome. He needed the money. So it's kind of funny where you have the public Jews murder Jesus kind of thing in the Roman Catholic Church, but in private he doesn't do anything as long as they give him kickbacks. He's okay with it. Again, it just shows you the hypocrisy of this guy and just he's a morally bankrupt person and just a bad dude, horrible manager, theological moron. I mean, I can't say worse things about Leo X. And what's funny is that when I talk to my Catholic friends about Leo X, they don't have anything better to say about him. They think he's pretty bad too. Just a couple of quotations that have been attributed to Leo. How well we know what a profitable superstition this fable of Christ has been for us. Now that's from the Catholic Encyclopedia. Again, not quoted positively. They don't like him, but gives you an idea that, oh, look at the money we could make on this. Catholic theologian and historian Ludwig von Pastor puts it this way: a man who so scarcely understood the obligations of his high office was one of the most severe trials God has ever subjected the church to. Again, these are Catholic sources that are very bad. So it gives you an idea that the papacy is at a low point morally, but trying to gain political power. It's bankrupt, so it needs money. Remember that. I need money to do all the stuff I'm doing, and I've bankrupted it. I'm going to have to do something. And he hits on what he's going to do. He's going to sell indulgences. He's going to give people money. And it's not just Albert he does this to. Anybody who wants a position in the church has to pay, and has to pay big to get what they want. He is buying and selling church offices like you wouldn't believe to enrich and replace the money that he has lost in his coffers. So, you know, I think about him, he's a mafia pope. You know, you think of the mafia in American history. They spent all their money, they stole more. That's how he looks upon it. It's a money-making opera. Okay, we spent all the money, we'll just get more. You know, not bright people. Now, we have to talk about what the Holy Roman Empire is. Now, the Holy Roman Empire actually goes back to the time of Charlemagne, so the 800s, if you will. Charlemagne is this great leader who really it's the end of the Dark Ages, the beginning of the High Middle Ages, and he's this great leader who really unifies Central Europe and Western Europe in what today are the countries of France and Germany and the Low Countries. That's all what we would call Charlemagne. And Charlemagne does all this with the blessing of the Pope. Again, Charlemagne's claim to fame is Charlemagne's grandfather, I believe, was Charles the Hammer, who stops the invasion of Islam into Europe, crushes them. And then Charles' son, Pepin, manages to replace the Merovingian dynasties with the Carolingian dynasty. And then Charles the Great is Pepin's son, and he really unifies power in a way and really makes Christianity solidifies Christianity, and he's tight with the Pope. And so when he's crowned as the new Roman Empire, the new Roman Emperor. He's crowned by the Pope, and so there's this linkage between this political entity that has been established by Charles the Great, by Charlemagne, and the Pope. So it's a political entity that is Pope. Now, who's in charge? Pope would say, "I'm in charge." The Holy Roman Emperor said, "I'm in charge. I have your blessing, though, but I'm in charge of it. That's my job. That's my wheelhouse." And there's this back and forth between and throughout the entire Middle Age, from 800 to 1356. There's a big back and forth. Who's, and because sometimes it's a secular ruler, sometimes it's a strong Pope. And so you have all kinds of trouble. Now, of course, what happens over time is this is Charlemagne's original empire. You see how much it covered, even into northern Italy, even into what we would call Hungary and Austria, places like that. Even parts of Spain is Charlemagne's empire. But when Charlemagne dies, he splits it among his sons, Charles the Bald, Lothar, and Lothair. Lothair pretty much loses out. Well, Charles the Bald, that ends up becoming France, what we know today as France. And then what's left are these piecemeal states of Lothar, which is we call the German states. And that's really kind of where it goes. You have all this patchwork of little German principalities, of which that you have parts. So when you take a look at the Holy Roman Empire, it's really all separated and piecemeal, but German speakers. That's one thing that unites them is Germans. They're all German speakers. And the other thing that unites them is that they have this connection to Charlemagne, this connection to the Holy Roman Empire. Well, it's the Wild West who runs it. And finally, again, this is at a low point in the papacy. They finally have the Golden Bull of 1356, and that says, okay, what this says is, this is basically the constitution of the Holy Roman Empire. And this is how we're going to decide who gets to rule this and who gets to control this, who gets to do this. It's going to be done by common consent. It's going to be done with electors. And the electors, you have 3 spiritual electors and you have 4 secular electors. And by their vote, they choose who the Holy Roman Emperor is, who's going to rule this collection of Germanic-speaking states. And you have the Archbishop of Trier, the Archbishop of Mainz, the King of Bohemia, the modern-day Czech Republic, the Margrave of Brandenburg, think of the area around Berlin, the Duke of Saxony, that's Luther's land, where Luther ends up being. You have the Archbishop of Cologne and the Count Palatine of the Rhine, so Western Germany. And so these are the electors. And that's going to play a major role in the politics that's going to get in there. But anyway, that's the Holy Roman Empire. Now, who are the big movers and shakers in the Holy Roman Empire? We have to talk about the House of Habsburg. Now, Frederick III, the Holy Roman Empire, that's the picture of the man on top. His son is Maximilian I Habsburg, and Maximilian's grandson is Charles V. Maximilian's son, Philip the Fair, Philip the Handsome, he dies very young, so he never really has a shot at the Holy Roman Empire. But the Habsburgs are people who have made quite a name for themselves by 2 things. Number one, they know how to marry well. The Habsburgs created their base of power not through war, but through good alliances. And so the Habsburgs initially are very minor noblemen, almost not even worth mentioning, in Switzerland. And they were able to parlay that into being the most powerful family. For instance, Charles V, during Charles V's day, he is the most powerful man in Europe. Many people wonder, why the Pope wouldn't grant a divorce for Henry VIII. Well, Henry VIII is married to Catherine of Aragon, who is Charles V's aunt. And the Pope says, well, Charles V has his boot on my neck, and if I dared do that, he would crush me like a bug. The fact of the matter is the Pope doesn't grant the divorce to Henry VIII, not because he doesn't want to grant a divorce to Henry VIII, but because he's so terrified of Charles V. And Henry, to be quite honest with you, if he wasn't in England, would be terrified of Charles V too. He has the biggest army, the biggest navy. Charles V, had he wanted to, could have crushed Henry like a bug. He had bigger things to do. This is the most powerful thing. Maximilian Habsburg is quite an interesting guy. He's a man who is a tremendously gifted tactician on the battlefield, tremendously gifted politician, and rules and extends his lands tremendously. He has a lot of kids, both inside of the marriages that are legitimate and outside of the marriages that are legitimate. So his fingers extend into many different aspects. Just a couple things about him. From his wife, he has one son who ends up marrying into the Spanish family. So remember, these guys are Hungary, Switzerland, Austria area. But his son, Philip the Fair, marries Joanna of Castile. Joanna of Castile is the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the same people who sent Columbus. And Joanna Castile marries Philip. Joanna Castile is also known as Juana the Mad. She just kind of goes nuts in her life. But Philip the Fair marries into, so he marries into the biggest and one of the most powerful families, one of the best brokerages. From that, they have a number of issues. Ferdinand, Charles, and Isabella, and Charles is will end up playing a big part. Charles is a very young man at the time. When he takes over the seat of the Holy Roman Empire, he's only 20 or so. A very young man, very inexperienced, but he becomes a very devout Catholic. This doesn't really have to do with our history, but it's interesting. Joanna of Castile's sister is Catherine of Aragon, and she marries Henry VIII, of course. And the picture above is the Ferdinand and Isabella. So just to show you how interconnected all of these families. I always laugh a little bit because in America we make fun of people in the South or intermarriage and things like that. People in the South are nothing compared to the Habsburgs. My goodness, the Habsburgs married cousins and things like that. Everybody was intermarried. It was kind of creepy, to be honest with you. But anyway, this is their empire, and just shows you just how much he controls. And when you look at the Holy Roman Empire aspect of this is a big part. It connects all of their other holdings. It gives you just how powerful this guy is, and why the Holy Roman Empire, why keeping hold of it. And because this unites all of the other lands together, we cannot give this up. And so we're not going to leave getting this passed on. Remember, every elector has to be elected. It's not passed on. This is not a genetic thing. It's the first elected official. And so in order for them to keep getting this, in order that it doesn't go to some other family, in order that the Holy Roman Empire isn't turned over to Henry VIII or turned over to Philip of France, we have to make sure that we have all the electors in our pocket. This is going to be a key thing for the Habsburgs, especially for Charles V and Maximilian. Now, you have kind of a tenuous relationship. The Habsburgs are devout Catholics because there's a connection between the historical creation of this empire with the Catholic Church, but there's also a tension. Don't get too big for your britches. So there's a tension on one side that we want to be Catholic, and the Catholic faith needs to hold our empire together, morally speaking. On the other side, don't step out of your lane. The other part that you have, we already talked about, they have a big political problem. And that big political problem is the Ottoman Empire is encroaching on their lands. And we need the Germans to fight for us. That means the electors hold a lot of power. We're not going to release our troops to you if you try to take Luther. And so one of the things that keeps Luther safe during these years, quite honestly, is that the Habsburg need the princes to military support more than they need the religious unity. And by the way, Lutherans don't have a problem with that. I have no problem fighting for, we have the idea of separation of church and state. I can serve faithfully a general who is not sure of my faith. We can serve the state quite honestly, and Luther encourages that even. But this is going to be a problem. We need to maintain power, so we need the electors on our side, but we also need to maintain safety, and we can't do that without the German princes supporting us militarily and providing troops for us militarily. We're going to have a big problem if we don't. And so you have a number of political and military exigencies that are really going to play into Luther's favor in the coming years. This is just something from the people. I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but it just shows that we wanted to make sure that everything was done correctly. So there is a stress, and this is going to come up over and over again in dealing with Luther's case, is that many of the electors in Luther's case are on Luther's side, saying Luther is a German citizen. He will be dealt according to the Holy Roman Empire, our German laws, our German citizens. We're not going to give him up. And you, Charles, you're going to abide by the Constitution. And that's going to play a major role. If Charles V had his way, he would have arrested Luther, ripped him down to Rome, had him burned at the stake by the end of business today. You can't do that because there's a constitution in place, there's military exigencies, and there are people, the Germans especially, force the rule of law. You do not break the rule of law. If you want a rebellion on your hands, you do not break the rule of law. One thing Germans don't do, Germans do not rebel, and Germans do not put up with people breaking their law. There's just historically a thing about German people saying, we have a constitution, you better abide by it, or else. So there is a constitutional structure that does kind of hem Charles V in. So he can't deal with Luther the way he wants to. He would just have him burned. That's what we do in Spain. That's what my grandmother would have done. My grandmother would have taken Luther and tied him at the stake and burned him. And that's what he wants to do his whole life, but he can't do it because the Germans have this constitutional structure and he needs their support. So he's kind of tied up. Now, there are papacy issues, there are Habsburg issues, but now there's intra-Holy Roman Empire issues. Now here on the one side, you see the descendants of the Habsburgs. Now, it's always funny, and always kind of threw me through a loop, that during a lot of these discussions around Luther, Charles V would talk to, the Elector Frederick and say, cousin. How are these guys cousins? He's Spanish. This guy's a German. How are these cousins? Well, there actually are cousins. Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III, his sister is Margaretha of Austria. And lovely woman. Interesting hairstyle. But Margaretha of Austria marries the Elector of Saxony, the Duke of Saxony, Frederick II. Okay. Well, Frederick has two sons. Frederick and Margaretha have two sons. And this is Saxony. And after they have their two sons, upon the death of Frederick II, for some reason, and it's really never adequately explained, I never have found a good explanation for it, but he splits Saxony into two political groups. You have the electoral Saxony, or Ernestine Saxony, and you have ducal Saxony, or Albertine Saxony. So it's split between his two sons. You notice on one side they're all wearing the garb of an elector with the cap and the mantle. And so ducal Saxony is somewhat wealthier, better lands, better growing lands. It also has some more prestige because it has the University of Leipzig. And the University of Leipzig is one of the older universities in Germany. And so Duke George, although he does not have the electoral power, is not a person who is poor, and he's not a person who's unimportant. He has this famous university, and he also has a bit of money behind him. So he's got power, but he doesn't have the power of the elector. He wants it, but he doesn't have it. That has gone to his cousin, Frederick. And Frederick says, you know what, I don't like that my part of Saxony doesn't have a university. I don't like the fact that George has a university. I don't have a university. So Frederick creates his own university in 1505. And that is the University of Wittenberg. So it's kind of interesting. Luther, remember, goes in the monastery in 1504. 1505 is the inauguration of the Wittenberg University. It's a brand new university, basically. Luther comes to the university a mere 7 years after its founding. So this is a university trying to get itself on its feet. We would call it something like a third-tier university, where it's not been established. It's new, but it has smart people behind it. It's bankrolled by the elector. And so the elector wants to get good professors, because good professors attract students, and the more students are attracted, the more prestige is attracted. So he's on the lookout. He wants, I want good guys. I want guys who are going to, set the world on fire. He wants good scholars, and he wants people to get there. He wants to get a good reputation. And one of the key early pickups is Luther. Staupitz says, this guy's really got a lot to offer. And he does. And so Luther becomes very fast the most famous professor at Wittenberg, but also one of the most loved professors at Wittenberg. And so you have this going on too. So you have Luther becomes important to Frederick because it adds prestige to its university. It becomes important to Frederick because it is one of Frederick's pet projects. The other thing that's really interesting about Frederick the Wise, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is he is the one elector who is known as the only incorruptible elector of the seven, which means he's the guy you couldn't bribe, and you dare not. He's the guy who you wanted the honest voting for. One of the things that is going to get Luther's case assigned to Germany is the fact that Frederick says, look, I'll give you my vote, Charles, cousin, but you're going to make a promise to me that he's going to be judged here and not in Italy and not in Spain. And Charles wants that vote so bad that he will say, okay, again, these politics play important. In order to get the concessions Frederick gets for Luther, he plays a very wise game. And he's known as the Wise. He is a guy who is playing mental chess always. He doesn't have the most power. He doesn't have the biggest lands, but he's a guy whose reputation precedes himself, and he is a guy who is a force to be reckoned with. So again, very successful. We'll talk more about him after the theses explode, but we'll leave that for now. And that last aspect of the whole Roman Empire is the Holy Roman Empire is the problem of the Brandenburg Brothers. Now, one of the electors of Saxony is the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the Margrave of Brandenburg is Joachim Nestor. His younger brother, and his younger brother is Albert of Mainz. Now, Albert in 1517 is not the Archbishop of Mainz. Yes, he's the Archbishop of Halberstadt and the Archbishop of Magdeburg, which are pretty good positions to have, but he's not an elector. Now, as this goes vacant, of course, the Brandenburg brothers say, hey, if we can get you that gives our family that much more power in electoral policy and getting in with the Habsburgs and getting in with the papacy, and there's only a plus. It's only going to put us in the much. And so they want to get this. There's only one slight problem. According to church canon law, you're not supposed to have more than one bishopric without papal dispensations. He already had been given a papal dispensation to have two. To have a third requires even a bigger papal dispensation. And in order to get that and the appointment, remember broke Leo? Leo's broke. He wants money, and these guys have it. And so these two know we're going to have to pay. And how are we going to do that? So they approach the Pope through a middleman. The middleman is the Fuggers, who are the famous banking family in the city of Augsburg. And the amount of pretense of this is just classic. Well, I think that the proper price for the bishopric would be 12,000 ducats, 1,000 for one of each apostle. That's what the Pope says to Albert. And Albert comes back with equal pretension. Well, I think a good amount would be 7. One for the 7 deadly sins. It's kind of funny. I have to say there's a little bit of a wink in the eye. Don't get greedy. And so they finally settle on 10,000. Now, the only problem is Albert doesn't have 10,000 ducats. And so, never spend your own money when you can always spend somebody else's. So they spend the Fuggers' money. So this is the way this works. We go to the Fuggers to get a loan of $10,000, which we'll get with interest, and to pay them back with interest. The Fuggers in turn will make out a loan. That loan will go to Pope Leo. That secures the Archbishopric of Mainz. In order to pay him back for this, Leo will authorize the selling of an indulgence for the building of St. Peter's in Rome. He will give Albert exclusive rights to collect for that. So he's not going to send his own guys up. He's going to let Albert do all the collection himself, be responsible for the selling and collection. Albert will collect the money. When Albert is done collecting the money, half will go to Leo. After you've received your $10,000, after you've paid back your loan, whatever's on top of that, whatever the total amount is, Albert, you get to keep half, and then half's going to have to come back to me. So Pope is getting not only 10,000 ducats, but also half of whatever the gross income is of the sale of indulgences after the Cougars are paid back. So there is a real issue here that in order to pay back this huge loan, this is a lot of money. We're talking in modern day terms, millions and millions of dollars worth of money. It's kind of like this. I don't know if this is a good one-to-one comparison, but the Los Angeles Unified School District decided they were going to put all these great Apple products in the public schools, and they decided to spend all that, only to find out that they hadn't gone through all the right loopholes to spend it, so they ended up in a huge financial problem. They put the school district in major debt. As a result, many of the school board people were fired or lost their election because of it. This is a big problem. This is a very expensive proposition. It's going to work, and it's based upon working upon the sale of indulgences in the territories of Albert of Mainz. You want to guess where Albert the Mainz territories cover? They cover all of the lands of Saxony. Now, it's interesting is that Frederick the Wise doesn't let the sale of indulgence go on in his territory because he has his own trade with the relics in the castle church. He doesn't let this, but remember that picture of Saxony. It's not too far. They don't have to travel too far to get an indulgence. They can cross a border and get into ducal Saxony and get that indulgence. But because of Luther's direct ecclesiastical superior, remember, this is the guy who's in charge of all the monasteries, all the churches, all the cathedrals in Luther's area. Because of what he is up to, he's going to be brought into direct confrontation with Luther. So how does an obscure German monk, pastor, preacher, professor in the backwater university upset and change the course of Western civilization? Well, you're going to have the upper card battle between John Tetzel, a Dominican, who is a master salesman of indulgences, versus Luther, the pastor, the professor, who looks upon the indulgence traffic that Tetzel is engaging in as a direct effrontery to Jesus Christ, as direct effrontery to the pastoral work of any Catholic priest, and this sets the stage. The powder keg for politics, papacy, spiritual problems. This is it, and it's now come directly into contact with Luther. I mean, just think about God's hand in this. Had this been the Archbishop of Canterbury, most likely the Lutheran Reformation would have never taken place. I mean, literally any other person could have had made this deal with the Pope, and Luther probably would have never been involved with it. But because it's Luther's direct superior, because it happens where Luther's a professor at, you can't help but see the hand of God in bringing this spark into contact with this powder keg and bringing all of these issues that we've talked about up to this point to the fore. So here's an example of an indulgence from the Middle Ages. By the way, indulgences are still sold today. During this time of coronavirus, there was a big story going around of Pope Francis offering an indulgence. So they haven't gone anywhere. They're less grotesque than in the Middle Ages, but they're still there. Now, let's talk about Tetzel, the master indulgence hawker. What did it cost? Well, if you were in top nobility, it cost you about 25 guldens, which is roughly about $1,000. They would expect top nobility to pay about $1,000 for a papal indulgence. Upper rank clergy and nobility, $700, give or take. Lower clergy, you're looking at the $300 range. Burghers and merchants, $200 to $100. Peasants, $50. And the destitute, you got them for free, but you had to prove that you were destitute, I suppose. It's kind of funny, again, here's this pretension, which again, if you look at this, it's not a bad statement, but why is that true for the destitute and not for anyone else? If you're giving it out of love, and Luther makes this point, if he's giving it out of love, why is he charging money to anybody for it? You know, if you were destitute, you got one for free, but you had to prove your destitution, I suppose. And I don't know how many were given out for free. Now, how did he do it? Well, Tetzel would come into town, and Tetzel is a master of this. He and his coterie would approach the town and was met by the dignitaries, and they entered in solemn procession, lofting high the papal banners. The papal indulgence was held aloft on a red velvet cushion. Tetzel would stop in the market area and make a speech. Listen now, God and St. Peter called you. Consider the salvation of your soul and souls of those of your loved ones departed. You priest, you merchant, you virgin, you matron, you youth, you old man. Now enter the church, which is the church of St. Peter. Visit the most holy cross erected before you and ever imploring for you. Have you considered that you are lashed in a furious tempest amid temptations and dangers of the world, that you don't know whether you shall reach heaven, not of your mortal body, but your immortal soul? Consider all who are contrite and have listened to and confessed their sins and will receive complete remission for all their sins. Listen to all the voices of your dear dead relatives and friends beseeching you and saying, I'm going to pause here before I go on to two big problems. One, he makes his purgatory in hell. He's giving people the impression you can get out of hell. But even the impression that you can get out of purgatory with money, that's a problem theologically, even according to the indulgence. Luther's going to raise that. The other problem is that you can get somebody else out of hell for it. An indulgence was only meant for a person, you, who were contrite. It was never extended to people beyond. Now, there had been anti-popes who had done such a thing, but he's really stretching the theological meaning of what these are to sell more of them. He's a master salesman. He's spinning this to make it sound like, you know, you get one of these, you got no problem. And he's good at it. He's very good at it. He is a master salesman. Now, let's go on. You hear your dead relative saying, pity us, we are in dire torment of which you can redeem us for a pittance. Do you not wish to? I'm going to pause again here. A number of pastors I've talked to have had this happen with members who have become members of a Lutheran church, but they grew up Catholic. And so you have a member who still has brothers and sisters who are Catholic members, and mom and dad who are good Catholics die. And all the brothers and sisters, well, we're going to buy a funeral mass for mom, and we want you to chip in. By the way, it's not free. And it'll take so many years off her head in purgatory. And the Lutheran member says, I'm not going to give to that. I'm not going to do anything. And the amount of guilt and shame the Catholic brothers and sisters, how dare you do something to mother's in purgatory, and you're not going to give to help her get out of it. And just the turmoil. And as a Lutheran, as a lifelong Lutheran, it just makes me angry, that kind of shameful guilt. The only thing that lessens my anger is that they don't know any better, or at least I hope they don't know any better, but certainly it's shameful. But I understand it. Even in the modern era, you still find it. Open your ears, hear your father saying to his son, mother to her daughter, we bore you, nourished you, brought you, have left our fortunes. And you were so cruel and hard, and now you're willing so little to set us free. Will you let us lie here in flames? Will you delay our promised glory? I find that's very much like the 10th evangelist, like Elmer Gantry. I think he's probably personally a real slimeball. But he has the right gear, he has the right method, he has the right showmanship. He probably would have been great in Hollywood, but not the kind of guy you want in the church. Have you ever seen the movie Leap of Faith with Steve Martin? I think it came out in late 80s, early 90s, but I think you get a good example of this type of tent revival. The tent revival is nothing new. The indulgence salesmen are the original tent revivalists. They get everybody whipped up into a frenzy. Don't you want peace? Don't you want security? Don't you want that comfort? They make them anxious with their speech. Here it is. Go pay for it. And they make money hand over fist. But notice three things. First of all, the indulgence was only good for the Pope to release you from the canons of repentance imposed by the church in this life. That's the only thing an indulgence was supposed to get you out of, was what the penitential canons of this life gave to you, it could release you from those. But Tetzel says, no, it can release you of whatever punishment God gives you in hell. No, Luther's going to make a big point of that. No, it can't. What God says you must pay, you're going to pay. The Pope can release you whatever the Pope gives to you, but he can't release you what God's going to give to you. Pope doesn't have the right to do that. Pope can't cancel. Pope can't say to the Heavenly Father, no, you don't have to listen to Heavenly Father, you can listen to me. You can't say that. Luther's going to make a big point of that 95 Theses. Tetzel was saying that not only can you get yourself out of purgatory, but your relatives who are in purgatory. The indulgence is being offered for money, not out of love or grace. If the Pope has this power, why is he charging for it? If you really have this power, what kind of cruel man is going to keep it from people for greed, for money? And the indulgence, as tells it, basically is saying you can buy your way out of sin. You don't need to go to mass. You just buy this piece of paper and you're covered. Okay. I saw something similar. I didn't see it, but the story related to me about my father-in-law. My father-in-law, for many years, he's retired now, but for many years he ran a catering and restaurant business in Montrose, Minnesota. And he'd cater for all kinds of events. And one of the things he catered for was the ordination of a priest. And my father-in-law was a curious guy, so I want to see this. So, everything's getting cooked up and ready, and he kind of sneaks in the back and watches this thing. They go through the whole rite of ordaining this priest, and they put oil on the priest and anoint him with oil, and they rub off the oil. And then the bishop who was ordaining him takes that napkin that has the oil on it, and he walks over to the mother of this priest who's being ordained. He gives him here, and this I want you to put in your casket on the day that you die. You gave your son to the church. And my father-in-law, after he saw that, he called me up and says, well, what do I give you? I gave you my daughter. It's kind of a sense of humor, but it's the same principle. This woman can be completely without faith and completely, but as long as she has this napkin with the oil of the ordination on it, she's good to go. How? And even if you say, well, it's just a symbol of her faith, even then it's a bad thing to say. Your confidence should be in Christ and Christ alone, not a napkin with oil on it, or not in a piece of paper, or not in the money that you paid. So this kind of thing, and this has a very practical problem with Luther. This is one of the more audacious statements that Tetzel makes at one of his sales. The indulgence can absolve a man who raped the Virgin Mary. That's just sacrilegious. I don't even, it's kind of interesting. Whatever happens to Tetzel, Tetzel dies in obscurity and a persona non grata even in his own day, because the powers that be said, had you not been such a jerk to say these awful things, you wouldn't have ticked off this guy and you wouldn't have started this whole mess. Tetzel's, you didn't have any problem when I was doing it before. I was making you money hand over fist. The famous statement that he makes, when the coin in a coffer clings the soul from purgatory springs. And again, you can just see how this, and remember, this is the system that's going to pay back the money to build St. Peter's in Rome, and Luther is about to throw a hand grenade into the whole system. And you'll see the dominoes. That's going to affect the Holy Roman Empire. It's going to affect the electors. It's going to affect everything. And so you're starting to see that the chain reactions. Luther responding to this indulgence traffic is going to have major repercussions when it comes to the politics of Germany, the society of the late Middle Ages, and the papacy. Now, Luther's response, and I want to stress this to you, Luther's response to this is pastoral. It comes from a sense of Luther is an angry pastor. He's angry at the lies that are completely contradictory to the Word of God that has brought comfort to his soul, and he is bringing to other people's soul. And this is a story, again, it may be apocryphal, but I have to believe that it happened quite often. One day, a pious monk went down the village and he spotted a sodden drunkard lying down in the gutter. As he attempted to get the man to his feet, he told the man that he was acting disgracefully and that he was embarrassing the whole village with his outrageous behavior. The man then went matter-of-factly informed him that he was in no way any type of sinner, and quite the opposite. He was sure to go to heaven when he passed on, a fact that even the pious monk could in no way state with any certainty. The man then reached into his coat pocket and produced a piece of paper that seemed to prove all the aforementioned points. You see, he had purchased an indulgence that absolved him from any and all sins, and further guaranteed him admittance to heaven when he passed on, no matter what level of abominable sin he had committed while still on earth. And that included all sins past, present, and future. One of those indulgences would be very handy. So we've seen the powder keg now. We've seen the spark. And next time we meet, you're going to see the explosion. And Luther just rips into this. Remember, Luther is very narrow in his attack. Luther is going after Tetzel. He's going after this maudlin indulgence hawking that he, in his naivety, believes that this guy is going well beyond. This guy is stating things that he shouldn't say. And you certainly, Luther has this attitude. The Pope certainly couldn't have supported this. There's no way the Pope would have signed off. And there's no way our Archbishop would have signed off on this. Oh, how naive Luther is. Luther is very naive, and so Luther goes in with the attitude, "Come on, guys! When I show what this guy is doing, they'll clean this up." And here's the funny part: had they done that, had the Archbishop said, "Okay, you've gone too far," and admonished Tetzel and put him on, had the Pope simply said, "You're right," I don't think the Reformation would have ever occurred. He would have been happy and gone on with life as an Augustinian friar. But they go after him, and then going after him, he goes deeper into Scripture. He starts working his theology more and more and more, and finally, you'll see Luther just as this volcano that explodes and takes the whole fabric of medieval society with him when he's done. All right, that brings us to the end of our study today. We thank you for joining us, and please join us again for our next session.